parents lied about a medical emergency to steal my $155,000 wedding fund to fund Golden Child's honeymoon, so I married in secret and bankrupted them. This is just a vent post, but any advice would be appreciated. Hello everyone. So I, 26F, recently got married to my husband, 26M, after a 6-year relationship. We had an intimate ceremony at his aunt's farmhouse property, which was not what we had initially envisioned. I had always dreamed of a beach wedding because that's where some of our happiest memories were made. My husband and I are both water babies, and we'd make a trip to the beach at least once a month to unwind and let loose. It's a special place for us, and I had even started looking at hotels where we could all stay. Like any other bride, I wanted my wedding to be unforgettable. For the past 5 years, I'd been saving up for a huge celebration. I work in advertising and earn a decent salary, but my husband and I lived modestly to save for the future. We'd planned to book one of the best hotels with a sea-facing view so our guests could have an amazing time. It was meant to be a luxurious experience, but we had to scale down considerably because my parents decided to borrow money from me a couple of months ago, and I couldn't bring myself to say no. Some context: my brother, 24 million, also got married a few months ago, but it was sudden and not well planned. He'd been with his wife for about 2 years and proposed just a month before their wedding. It was a small ceremony with only family and a few friends, but I was happy for him. It was their wedding, their choice. A few weeks after his wedding, my mother reached out to me, asking to borrow $115,000. She told me my father had fallen ill suddenly, likely due to his diabetes acting up again. She said she couldn't handle the medical expenses alone and needed my help. She mentioned a special drug the doctors had recommended, but it was expensive because it had to be imported, and their insurance didn't cover it. I was really concerned for my father's health, so I decided to step up and lend my mother the money without asking too many questions. I paid my dad a couple of visits and repeatedly asked my mother to show me the medical reports, but she always managed to dodge those questions. Every time I visited, my dad was in bed, but he didn't seem particularly sick. When I asked my mother why he hadn't been moved to the hospital for professional care, she told me it wasn't necessary at the moment. Yet somehow, he was sick enough to need an uncommon imported drug that wasn't covered by their insurance. I'm not an idiot. After the first few visits, I started to suspect something fishy was going on. But I didn't want to accuse my parents of anything without being sure. It would have looked terrible if I accused them of lying about a medical emergency just to borrow money, only for it to turn out to be true. Still, the pieces weren't adding up. I noticed my brother hadn't been visiting our parents, and when I asked why, my father said they didn't want him to worry, because he was so young and needed to focus on his work. Meanwhile, they were fine with me being worried sick about them. A couple of weeks later, I finally spoke to my brother on the phone. He still hadn't visited our dad, and when I brought it up, he casually mentioned he'd drop by as soon as he got back from his honeymoon. That was news to me. I had no idea he'd already left for his honeymoon. My parents hadn't told me, and neither he nor his wife had posted anything about it on social media. When I asked why he hadn't told me, he said he'd been planning to surprise everyone by coming back after a month of being MIA with a bunch of photos, stories, and memories from their trip around Europe. He admitted he hadn't planned to tell me at all, but he'd been concerned when I mentioned our father was sick, which is why he decided to respond. He told me he'd spoken to our parents after my alarming text, but they'd assured him everything was fine and there was nothing to worry about. According to him, our parents had probably exaggerated the situation while talking to me, and I'd believed it because I was kind of neurotic, which led to a misunderstanding. I tried to give my parents the benefit of the doubt, forcing myself to believe they'd hidden the truth from my brother to avoid ruining his honeymoon or making him worry. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen at their house, and there was no room for misunderstanding. Then, my brother dropped a bombshell. Our parents were funding his insanely expensive and long honeymoon. All the warning bells started going off in my head. I asked him exactly how much the trip was costing, and he casually mentioned it was at least $125,000. He and his wife were pulling out all the stops, staying in the most expensive hotels, eating at the best restaurants, and shopping for luxury items. And all of it was being covered by our parents. I knew instantly where my money had gone. There was no medical emergency. There never had been. That's why they had no documents to show me. Why they'd never even been to the hospital. My parents had invented the whole story because they wanted the money to fund my brother's honeymoon. That was supposed to be their wedding gift to him. I felt utterly betrayed as I listened to my brother brag about how our parents were going above and beyond for him, just so he and his wife could enjoy their honeymoon. They hadn't been able to have a grand wedding, so this was their way of making up for it. The money I'd lent my parents came from my wedding fund, and when I realized they'd given it all to my brother, it felt like a knife to the back. When I confronted them after that phone call, my parents admitted they'd made up the story because they knew I wouldn't have given them the money if I'd known it was for my brother's honeymoon. They explained that he'd been struggling at work and had been down in the dumps for a long time, so they wanted him to have some fun without worrying about money. Unfortunately, they couldn't fund it themselves without jeopardizing their retirement savings, so they'd borrowed from me. Their reasoning? I was young, still earning, and had plenty of time to work and save the money back. They, on the other hand, didn't have that luxury. They also said it was just money and promised to return it eventually, but for now I needed to put myself second and think about my brother's feelings. Apparently, this honeymoon had rejuvenated him and saved him from slipping into depression. I couldn't believe it. This meant I'd have to cut down on my wedding expenses for no reason. To be clear, I'd been okay with having a smaller wedding if it meant my father's health wouldn't suffer. But this wasn't something I'd signed up for. I was furious when they told me the truth, and I demanded they pay me back before my wedding. I needed that money for my own expenses. My husband and his family were covering some of the costs, but I still had to contribute. A beach wedding wasn't cheap, and I'd been saving for years to make it happen. My parents had never planned to pay for my wedding. They'd told me early on that they could either pay for my college or my wedding, but not both. I'd chosen college and decided to save for my wedding myself. For context, I asked my brother if our parents had made him choose between the two as well. He laughed in my face like it was the most ridiculous idea he'd ever heard. I never brought it up with my parents because I didn't want to accuse them of favoritism, even though it was painfully obvious. I was young and still needed their help at the time, so starting a fight over it would have only made things worse for me. But years later, when I confronted them about the money they'd taken and their blatant favoritism, they tried to deny it. It was as clear as day, though, and I told them they had to pay me back. I wasn't going to give up my dream wedding just because my brother was struggling at work. If they wanted to mollycoddle him by sending him on an expensive vacation, they could use their own money. I hadn't worked my ass off for 5 years and saved up just for them to hand that money to my brother. But they told me they couldn't return the money all at once before the wedding. It would take them a couple of years to pay me back, and they expected me to be okay with it. After all, family comes first. If I was willing to spend that money on a medical emergency for my father, then why couldn't I spend it to prevent my brother from slipping into depression? Here's the thing, though. My brother was never going to get depressed because of work. He never took his job seriously, which is why he was bad at it and earned so little. He works in sales, and his income is almost entirely commission-based. If he's bad at his job, he has no one to blame but himself. Sure, he might have been a little upset about it, but I can guarantee he was never going to get depressed. He just didn't care enough because he'd been spoiled by my parents his entire life. He wasn't used to working hard for anything, which is why he seemed so upset about his job. That was all it was. But my parents blew it out of proportion to make it seem like he was on the verge of a breakdown and needed rescuing. It was all a load of baloney. I tried to explain to my parents how important my wedding was to me. They'd already made commitments to my husband and his family about covering certain expenses, and without that money, it would be impossible. But they told me there was no way they could return the money before the wedding. I'd just have to scale down or ask my husband and his family to help out. It got to the point where I was literally begging them to return my money, but they just shook their heads and said no. They'd return it eventually, but giving it back before the wedding wasn't possible. I left their house crying, and when I got home and told my husband everything, he was just as furious, if not more. He was ready to contact a lawyer, but I stopped him. There was no written proof that my mother had asked for the money for medical reasons or had ever promised to return it. Everything had been informal, with no binding contracts or documents to back up a single claim. Even if we filed a lawsuit, it would only waste more of our money on legal fees, and we'd likely lose because we couldn't prove anything. We didn't even have texts in our favor. It had all been verbal and off the record. As much as we wanted to hold my parents accountable, we decided against it. It would have been pointless, and we didn't want to throw more money into a hopeless situation. Instead, we shifted our focus to figuring out how to adjust our wedding plans. Thankfully, my husband's family stepped up after they found out what my parents had done. His aunt offered to let us use her farmhouse venue for free. We'd always been set on a beach wedding, so his aunt hadn't suggested it earlier, but now that we were exploring other options, she brought it up. I decided to check it out. My husband had seen the place before, but when I walked in for the first time, I knew it was perfect. It was beautiful, and even though it wasn't near the beach, my husband and I were content with it. The fact that his aunt was letting us use it for free made the decision even easier. We started planning around the farmhouse, and it gave me a reason to fully cut my parents off. I'd already decided they weren't going to be invited to the wedding, but I'd been on the fence about my brother. He hadn't technically done anything wrong. He didn't know my parents had borrowed money from me to fund his honeymoon. But he made the decision for me when he called me after returning from his trip. He tore into me for humiliating our parents by demanding they return the money. He'd heard about the situation from our mom and was upset that I was being difficult. Apparently, he thought it was no big deal, even though he was the one who'd spent my money. He claimed he'd pay me back as soon as he could, but insisted I needed to suck it up and scale down the wedding. That was the moment I made up my mind about him too. After that, I didn't speak to any of them. Without my full wedding fund, I couldn't splurge on a luxurious, over-the-top celebration. Honestly though, it worked out for the best. The wedding we ended up having was far more beautiful than anything I'd originally imagined. We had to scale back, but it was worth it. Over time, we realized the day was supposed to be about us, and in our daily lives, we weren't the kind of people we were trying to portray with a fancy wedding. It would have felt shallow to go all out just to impress others. So, we decided to cut costs and use the money we saved for something more meaningful later on. In a way, I'm grateful for how things turned out. My wedding was still dreamy and beautiful, but it lacked the pomp and show I'd initially envisioned. It was intimate, surrounded only by the people who truly loved and supported us. And really, that's all you need for a wedding. A couple of days ago, everyone from my family who had been invited to the wedding was given very strict and specific instructions. Make sure my parents and brother didn't find out the invitations had already been sent out. If they found out, they'd throw a tantrum since they weren't invited. That's how we managed to have a private ceremony without them showing up or trying to bully me into inviting them beforehand. But now that the wedding was over and everything had gone smoothly, I didn't see anything wrong with posting the photos on social media. Somehow, they saw the photos and contacted me the very next day, demanding an explanation as to why they hadn't been invited. Honestly, I was surprised they even expected an invitation. The last conversation I had with any of them hadn't been pleasant. I'd been crying when I left my parents' house after our last fight, and we hadn't spoken since. The last time I spoke to my brother, he made me feel like everything was my fault and that I was being dramatic. After that, I hadn't spoken to any of them, and they hadn't tried to talk to me either. So, I didn't know why they expected to be invited. Not only did they expect an invitation, but they were upset they weren't at the wedding. My parents were the ones who called me, and then they added my brother to the call so all three of them could yell at me at once. I didn't care for it. I found it incredibly entitled. I'd already cut them out of my life, and I didn't need this drama while trying to enjoy my life as a newlywed. So I told them that after they'd stolen money from me, I had to cut down on the cost of the wedding. I decided only to invite family and a couple of close friends, and since they were neither, they didn't make the list. After that, I hung up and blocked them, hoping they'd leave me alone. But an hour after that phone call, my husband told me my brother had reached out to him. My brother wanted to inform us that my parents had been really insulted by what I'd said. My mother was devastated. She kept crying and almost fainted because she was crying so hard. That's all he said, but I started feeling guilty. I didn't mean to hurt my parents that badly. He might be bluffing, but I don't know for sure, and it's been making me feel weirdly bad ever since. I started second-guessing myself for not inviting my parents and brother to my wedding, even though they'd stolen money from my wedding fund. Hello everyone. To keep this video going, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and helps us continue bringing you great stories. So if you enjoy our content, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support makes a huge difference. Alright, let's keep going. Update 1. It's been a week since that last conversation with my parents and brother, and I've decided I'm not going to speak to them again. My mother can cry as much as she wants, but it's not going to change the facts. I'd been crying really hard the day I confronted them about the money. I'd even begged them to return it to me before the wedding, but they didn't seem to care. They'd taken it lightly, so now I was going to do the same to them. You reap what you sow. I also told my brother never to contact me or my husband, especially my husband, because he had nothing to do with any of this. I didn't want my family bothering him with their petty antics. After that text, I blocked him again because I didn't want my family to have any access to me. They'd treated me badly all my life, but now I wasn't going to take it anymore. If I had a way, I'd even file a lawsuit against them and get my money back. But that might be a long shot right now since we don't have tangible evidence. My husband thinks it's worth a try and might just work, so we've been considering it. He's been in talks with a reputable lawyer, and in a couple of days, we're going to make a decision about what to do. Until then, I just have to think of a way to make them confess or admit to the fact that they'd borrowed the money from me under the pretext of using it for a medical emergency. Instead, they gave it to my brother so he could have a fun honeymoon. It's going to be difficult to prove in court, but I don't want to let them off the hook so easily. I deserve to get my money back, and I'm going to do whatever it takes to make sure they return it, and soon. Update 2. Yesterday, I told my brother not to bother my husband with our family drama, so of course, he took it as a sign to drag him into it even more, even though it doesn't involve him. After we got back from work, my husband told me that my parents and brother had sent him a bunch of texts, demanding that he speak to me and tell me to unblock them. When he blocked them, they decided to take it a level higher and actually showed up at his workplace. Apparently, they'd been waiting for him right outside, and as soon as they saw his car leaving, they started tailing him and honking repeatedly. He had to pull over because he recognized my brother's car and knew it was them. He also knew that if he didn't stop, they'd just follow him home, and that would have really bothered me. So he decided to take one for the team and entertain their nonsense. When he pulled over, my brother got out of his car, walked up to my husband's window, and said they wanted to speak to him in person. There was a diner nearby, and my husband just wanted to get it over with. They took a booth, and my family started unloading whatever they believed was so important. My brother told him that it wasn't fair for me to cut everyone off over some money and thought it was an overreaction. They also thought that me implying we weren't family anymore just because they'd borrowed money from me was taking things too far. Since I'd already blocked them, they couldn't reach out to me directly. But they figured if my husband spoke to me, I might listen. They were trying to appeal to him, hoping he'd remind me that we were a family no matter what, and that I needed to act like it, instead of throwing tantrums over every little misunderstanding and acting like a brat. My parents also claimed they were going to return the money eventually. It just wasn't possible for them to give it back all at once. They'd already explained this to me 1,000,000 times, so I needed to be more thoughtful because my brother was struggling at work and they were about to retire in a couple of years. They were trying to convince my husband that this was all my fault and that I was acting out for no reason, but my husband played it brilliantly. Instead of putting them in their place, he entertained their nonsense and made them feel like he was on their side. He told them he'd try to explain things to me, but it would help more if they reached out to me personally with a heartfelt message. So far, they'd only taken an accusatory tone with me, but my husband convinced them that if they acknowledged their mistakes, it might calm me down. And those idiots actually bought it. My husband manipulated them into sending me a message where they acknowledged what they'd done, making them believe it would make me go easy on them, maybe even apologize. Of course, it's all baloney. As soon as they sent that message, we planned to use it as an admission of guilt and go after them legally. I'm actually really proud of my husband because he handled this much better than I would have. I think he's an evil genius, but he's my evil genius, so I love him. Update 3. Well, my husband's plan worked, and we're so pumped right now. My parents and brother, like the idiots they are, sent me an email detailing every single lie they'd told and confessing to everything they'd done. Now that we have proof, my husband has given our lawyer the green light to go ahead with the petition. Soon enough, we'll be getting our money back. $115,000 might not be a lot to some people, but to me, it means everything. I spent the last 5 years saving up for the future, working incredibly hard to get where I am today. It took countless late nights and sacrifices, and I'm not about to let it all go to waste just because my brother is lazy and my parents want to enable him. So, we're suing them, and no matter what it takes, we will get my money back. We've also started planning our honeymoon. It's going to be a short trip to the beach, again, because that's where this all started, and it'll always be a special place for us. We might take a longer break in a couple of months and make an actual vacation out of it, but for now, this will have to do. We've realized we don't need to impress people or spend a ton of money. We can just do whatever makes us happy, and that's exactly what we're doing. Also, I don't want to be like my brother, who posted a bunch of photos from his honeymoon to rub it in people's faces. Now, he's going to be sued for it. It's really sad for them, but they brought this on themselves. They totally deserve whatever's coming to them.